Hey everybody, welcome back. Today we are looking at 2 Chronicles chapter 10 through chapter 12. And if you listened to the podcast yesterday we were in 1 Kings 12 to 14. This is going to be very, very similar as it's like pretty much the record of the same kings. We're looking at King Rehoboam, who is the king in the south over Judah and Benjamin, and then King Jeroboam, that is the king over the northern tribes in Israel. And all of this, this kind of split, divided kingdom is the result of Solomon turning away from the Lord, and ultimately the result of the Davidic covenant. God said that he would prosper the throne of David as long as the people stayed committed to God's law. And here we see that the people are not committed to God's law, just like Solomon was not committed to God's law. And because of that, God allows the kingdoms to split. So we end up with Jeroboam in the north, with about twice as many people falling under him, and Rehoboam in the south. And you get this opening story, the same one we looked at yesterday, where the people ask Rehoboam to be merciful. He refuses to be merciful. And it's basically because he listened to younger, dumber counselors. They gave him bad counsel. He made bad choices, and ultimately it split the kingdom. And that brings us to the first thing that I think is really interesting. This is chapter 10, verse 15. So the king did not listen to the people, for it was a turn of affairs brought about by God, that the Lord might fulfill his word, which he spoke by Ahijah the Shilonite to Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. So if all you're doing is looking at the surface of this story, it's like, oh, Rehoboam, why didn't you just, make a wise decision? Why didn't you listen to all those gray hairs in your whatever cabinet or kingdom who were telling you to actually be nice to your people? Well, the answer is not that Rehoboam made a bad choice. The answer is that God led Rehoboam's heart sovereignly to make a poor choice, because God was judging Solomon for his sin of turning against God, and here it affects Rehoboam. Now, Rehoboam also, we know, is not completely committed to God, because he is going to turn away from God in pretty fantastic fashion as well. But the first thing that I wanted to highlight is that chapter 10, verse 15 shows us that God is sovereignly acting in all these things. God is ultimately in control, and God is ultimately playing out the commandments that he's given. He says, hey, if you follow me and listen to me and obey me, I will bless you. And if you refuse to follow me, it will affect your reign and your kingdom. And we see this here. Like a prophet had already spoken to Solomon saying, hey, this is going to get all torn apart. And this kingdom is going to be split. And so here God is causing Rehoboam to make a poor choice to affect the kingdom in the way that God intended. There's no question that God's hand is on this, and God is ultimately completely in control. Now, if at the beginning of this reading in chapter 10, we're learning about God's sovereignty causing the nation to split, then probably in chapter 12, we're seeing that God is sovereign over this attacking king, King Shishak from Egypt, because Rehoboam humbles himself and repents for his sin, and God does not allow King Shishak from Egypt to advance as far as he would have had the people not repented. So we see here God being faithful to his promises, which is a core thing in the majority of the Old Testament, even into the New Testament. When God says he will do something, when God sets the conditions, he holds to his word and keeps those conditions. And they're very simple. If you obey me, I will bless you. If you disobey me, I will curse you, and people will come against you. We see that playing out in this text. The second thing I want to call out is 2 Chronicles chapter 12, verse 1. When the rule of Rehoboam was established and he was strong, so he like Rehoboam apparently followed the Lord faithfully as king for about 3 years. He did what he was supposed to. He did not allow his heart to chase after foreign gods. But then he starts to make a couple mistakes after his 3 years of reigning. So it says, when the rule of Rehoboam was established and he was strong, he abandoned the law of the Lord, and all Israel with him. Now, here's what's interesting, and I don't know that we've talked about it a lot on the podcast. The actual text says that he abandoned the law of the Lord. It does not say that he abandoned the Lord. It says he abandoned the law of the Lord. And so we learn here in the Old Testament, multiple times in the Old Testament, I'm just picking it out today, that abandoning God's law, disobeying God's law, is literally the same thing as disobeying God himself in general. You get this idea that if you're not going to know God's commandments, if you're not going to be obedient to God's commandments, ultimately, you just plain don't love God. And it's a really interesting concept because Jesus later on is going to say, if you love me, you'll obey my commandments. And so the Bible does not really ever split loving God from loving God's law. They're kind of one and the same thing. Even in the New Testament, the Bible doesn't split loving Jesus and following Jesus' commandments. They are one and the same. And I think kind of what's interesting is that culture will try to split those two things up. Like, hey, I really do love Jesus. You know, I just struggle to do what he said. Or I really do love Jesus. I just don't really see myself doing, X, Y, or Z. It could be, I don't see myself being part of a church. I don't see myself following kind of this traditional understanding of love and marriage. I don't see myself using my money in that way. Like Jesus commands many things about these kinds of things. And the way the biblical writers understood it was that if you love Jesus, you do what Jesus says. If you love God, you do what God says. So the problem that's getting called out here in chapter 12 is that Rehoboam disobeyed God's law, and because he disobeyed God's law, it was obvious that he did not, in fact, have relationship with God. So I just want to call out, like, it's really dangerous to try to split and try to live kind of this dual reality of, I love Jesus, but I just struggle to do what he says. I love the Lord, but I can't always be committed to what he says I should do. Man, I love God so much, I just can't be bothered to read or understand his word and the commandments that are in them. If you start to believe that way, you're in a tough, tight spot. And many of the stories in the Bible would say you're actually becoming disobedient to God himself. One of my favorite examples is like saying, man, I just love spending time with my wife. I just love her so much. I want to be around her so much. I just can't be bothered to hear what she has to say or do what she asks. But man, I love her. And anybody hearing that would know immediately, like, hey, you're really not being authentic about your relationship. And if you find yourself in a place, or if you know someone that's in a place of saying they love Jesus, but they can't do X, Y, or Z that Jesus clearly commanded, they're just not really in a place where they actually have a relationship with Jesus. They may not really be in a place where they actually are a follower of Jesus. Sometimes it feels good to say that you love Jesus, but if your life doesn't reflect the things that he commanded, that's not good. And so the first thing to take comfort in is that God is gracious and merciful. He's long-suffering. We see this over and over and over again in the biblical text through the Old Testament, through what we've already read. And God is eager to forgive us when we repent and come back under his law and under his commandments. We actually see this with Rehoboam. Rehoboam is like, hey, I messed up. God, I want to follow you. I want to love you. Please forgive me for my disobedience. And God hears him immediately and forgives him for his disobedience. Jesus tells this story of the prodigal son, where he just literally makes every terrible decision he possibly could, and almost on a dime turns around and returns to the father, and the father runs out to embrace him because the father loves him. Like, God loves us and will forgive us. So please, if you're in a place where you're saying you love Jesus, but you don't obey his commandments, please know that God is gracious. He loves you. He wants to have a relationship with you. Recognize your sin and turn back to God and embrace his loving self, and come back under his commandments. If you are in a good place with the Lord and you are connected to somebody who says they love Jesus but don't seem to do what he says, I think there's a lot of room for conversation there. Like, hey, I know you really love Jesus. I know that you're a huge fan of what the Lord is doing. I'm just curious about like why you're not making life decisions that reflect that. Like why are you using your money in that way? Why are you handling your relationship that way? Why are you using your time that way? It seems like you're saying you love Jesus, but you're not doing the things he commanded. That's a problem. Let's get to a place where you are reflecting with your life that you love the Lord. So I think it's something you can miss if you read it too quickly, but I do think it's important to call out that the Bible doesn't differentiate. And when we are under God's law and under his commandments, that's when we really are in relationship with him. And that is what we want. We want to be following Jesus. We want to be accurately representing him to the world around us. And it's a challenge for us today. So your part is just to, wrestle with that. Like, are you in alignment with God's plan for your life? And if you're not, what's it look like to come back into alignment? So pretty interesting things today. Kind of King Jeroboam, King Rehoboam, this divided kingdom. We already talked about it yesterday. We're talking about it again today. But we are entering into a new phase of biblical history as we read through this, just seeing how God is moving through different kings in different places, and ultimately how he is going to accomplish his goal, even when it looks like this Davidic dynasty is falling apart before our eyes. So we'll be back again tomorrow. We'll see you then.
Thanks so much for listening to God's Plan, Your Part. If anything stuck out to you, if you have any questions, or if you'd like to receive a Bible, you can email us at godsplанyourpart@gmail.com. Also, if you're enjoying the podcast, please consider supporting us through the link in our description. We love that you're on this journey with us, and we hope you have a great day. See you tomorrow.